What was once told as fiction is now confirmed as fact. In this two-part presentation, Dr. Michael Salla reveals the history, the science, the technology, and just who has been hacking and fracking with our existence and our reality.
Welcome everyone. Aloha. Howdy all. We are shooting live from the beautiful state of Tennessee. And I welcome you all to this webinar on time travel, temporal warfare, and our future. I know many of you have done preceding webinars, but some of you may not have done some of those that actually pertain to what we are doing today. I've talked previously about space arcs arriving in our solar system or being activated in our solar system. I've talked about portals being found, creating a network all over the planet. And we've talked about halls of records, also found throughout the planet. Now, these are some of the topics I've already covered, and most of you have probably watched those webinars. But for those who haven't, what we're doing today kind of like develops, flows on from that. It gives us more of an idea of exactly how all of these things are part of a much larger tapestry. Because what we're witnessing right now is really unique. I mean, this is something that people have been predicting for a long, long time. People have been saying that we are going to experience these end times, a time of great change on our planet. And there were predictions that it would happen in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, by 2012. And none of that really panned out. But right now, what we're witnessing truly is unprecedented. And I think we are at this end of an age. And we are kind of in the middle of what I think really is a dark night of the soul. When you go out and read the media, whether it's the mainstream propaganda or even the alternative media putting out a counter narrative, the end result is somewhat depressing. It kind of puts you in a place where you really need to take time out and go out into nature, spend time in forests or in the country or on the water, and to find ways to rejuvenate yourself. So, because at the moment, things don't seem to be moving really quickly. They seem to be at a point where things are kind of stuck. But if you've covered the material, if you've listened to the earlier webinars, there's a lot happening behind the scenes. A tremendous amount happening behind the scenes. But on the surface, it does seem to be very dark, very depressing, kind of like dark night of the soul stuff. So this is where hopefully what I'm going to be presenting to you today, when we look at time travel, is going to give you a bigger perspective. You're going to get an idea of exactly how different groups have been engaging with one another in this temporal war and where we are right now in this temporal war. Because we're coming to an end of it. And each of us actually has a really important role to play in what is coming. And the very fact that you're here watching this, you're here because you know there's something very profound about the time travel topic. And when I go through all of the material, I think you'll get a sense not just of the technological side of time travel, how it's being used, how it's being developed, and the history of it, but you're also getting a sense of how we as individuals actually can be very relevant to the whole time travel topic. It's not just something relevant to technology. So that's something I'll get to. And But I think we can get a lot of hope from that, because if we recognize where we as organic beings with consciousness and DNA, that we can be plugged into something where we actually can get some of this incredible information from the future, it's going to give us more confidence that what we are in the middle of right now is just almost like a rite of passage. Because I think that is, what we're experiencing as a planetary culture. It's like a rite of passage. It's like if you want to graduate into the galactic community, you have to go through this graduation process where you learn to deal with these dark forces that somehow got control over your world, over our civilization, have manipulated us for a long, long time, and then we gradually awaken to that and we shake that off. And once that happens, then we're ready to join the galactic community, because we've already experienced, I think, during the Atlantean period, we experienced where the dark night of the soul ended badly, where the dark forces really were able to hold on, and those of us that wanted to bring in a better world, we failed. But this time around, we're talking 11,000 years later, a different outcome is happening. So this is hopefully what you'll be able to kind of get a sense of and maybe feel more confident about as we go through this webinar. So let me begin. And where do you begin studying and understanding the history of time travel? Well, the best place to begin is Nikola Tesla. Now, one of the things that is fascinating about Tesla was that, we all know about his phenomenal achievements in developing AC electricity, radio wireless, but he was experimenting with his Tesla coils. This is one of his inventions that he discovered that in 1891. And by 1895, he was creating these enormous electrostatic charges and rotating magnetic fields, and kind of like analyzing and studying what would happen with these. And one of the things that he found was that these warped space-time. So Tesla is a really good starting point for understanding the history of time travel, because he says that when he was in the midst of one of these experiments using his Tesla coils, generating these enormous electrostatic charges and rotating magnetic fields, that, quote, I could see the past, present, and future all at the same time. So Tesla, in 1895, using his Tesla coils, was able to see through the veil and see the past and the future. And that was the beginning. And as we will see later on, the Tesla coil actually is a very important part of modern time travel technology. But this is how it all began in 1895, when Tesla first observed the effect of one of his Tesla coils. Now we know 10 years later, in 1905, Albert Einstein came up with his special theory of relativity, and for him, the speed of light is this absolute in the universe, and that as a particle approaches the speed of light, time slows down, kind of time dilation happens. And so there you can see that illustration where the rocket leaves, is traveling at a speed near the speed of light. Now, the time on the rocket ship, it shows that, just imagine that that measures that clock on the rocket and the clock above the Earth, that they measure years. So on the clock on the rocket, if you're traveling near the speed of light and you travel very large distance, it showed, well, that you're gone for like five minutes or five light years. 5 years. But on Earth, 25 light years, or 25 years have passed. So time dilates for those traveling near the speed of light, whereas those on Earth, time proceeds normally. Now, this also means that as you pass the speed of light, that time can reverse. You actually have time reversing for faster than light travel. So this is something that 5 years later, you had Albert Einstein and a famous German physicist by the name of Arnold Sommerfeld conducting a thought experiment using the idea of time and the speed of light being the absolute pivotal point by which time can slow down or reverse itself. So at the speed of light, if you can exceed the speed of light, then Einstein and Sommerfeld said, well, if you could find something that could go faster than light, a kind of tachyon, then you have a means to telegraph into the past. So that was the thought experiment in 1910, and they called that the tachyonic anti-telephone. And so the tachyon, that was something that was developed by Arnold Sommerfeld, and the actual term itself was named by another physicist, Gerald Feinberg. So tachyons are a class of particles that travel faster than the speed of light. Arnold Sommerfeld was the first to propose them, and they have a very strange property that when they lose energy, they actually gain speed, which is the opposite to sublight speeds. You know, as you gain energy, you start to approach the speed of light. While tachyons, as they gain energy, they actually slow down. And that the slowest possible speed for a tachyon is the speed of light. So this is one of the properties of tachyons. So for Einstein and Sommerfeld back in 1910, this was a theoretical concept. It was a thought experiment. But nevertheless, they saw that this was something that was consistent with what was known about the behavior of, or this was consistent with relativistic physics, the special theory of relativity. And what this means, to kind of summarize it, is there's a nice, cute limerick. Reginald Buller came up with this time travel limerick. There was a young lady named Bright, whose speed was faster than light. She went out one day in a relative way and returned the previous night. So that's a famous limerick, and it kind of encapsulates this tachyonic anti-telephone thought experiment, or how tachyons behave. That a tachyon, or something using tachyon particles to propel themselves, that you can actually arrive before your departure. Very important, and I will return to that later on, to that idea. But the point is, in terms of time travel, if you are developing technology for time travel, it will be very useful to know that you have this capability of actually arriving at your destination before your departure. And how can you do that? And what would be the effect of that? We'll talk about that shortly. Now, 5 years later, in 1915, Albert Einstein comes up with his general theory of relativity. And this one actually works with macroscopic events like stars and black holes, where space-time distorts with gravitational fields. So the larger the gravitational field, whether we're talking about a sun, we're talking about a pulsar or a black hole, that time again distorts. So a gravitational field can distort time in terms of slowing the pace of time, and there you have different clocks showing what happens as you approach a black hole, that time slows down relative to the observer, to the person actually approaching the black hole, that time is slowing down. But for those outside of that, for the normal observer, time is moving along as normal. So you can see the different clocks there showing, like the one at the left shows that on the left shows that the experiment begins at approximately 12 minutes after 9, and then it shows, say, the one at the very end, it shows that very little time has passed because you've approached the event horizon of a black hole, but that the normal observer, you've got time having moved approximately 20 minutes, and that can be 20 minutes, 20 light hours, 20 light years, whatever. So this is Einstein's general theory of relativity also came up with a way to distort time. So far we've seen two ways in which time travel can occur, either by approaching the speed of light or exceeding the speed of light in some way, or by increasing the gravitational field. So those are two different ways in which time can be distorted that could be used for developing a time travel machine. So let me move over here to Maria Orsic and time travel as far as what she was doing. Now, Maria Orsic, a very famous psychic that in 1919 began channeling these extraterrestrials who claimed to be from Aldebaran. And she was very influential because based on the accuracy of her information, she impressed a lot of German secret society members. This wasn't just someone saying, well, I'm getting communications from extraterrestrials and this is what they're saying. Now, this was someone who was shown to be a very accurate psychic that so impressed members of the German secret societies, and we're talking about the Vril Society. These were very hardcore German industrialists and secret society members, and they were very impressed by the accuracy of her psychic communications, that when she said that she is getting communications from these beings from Aldebaran, they believed her because that was Orsic's reputation. So very, very accurate and very impressive young lady. And what I've found from a number of more recent contactees, they actually say that Orsic was not really a human. Well, she could have been a human in terms of like a starseed, but more than likely she was actually a member of the Galactic Federation of Worlds that at a very young age had arrived on Earth and was raised by her family and had these incredible abilities. And interestingly, Nikola Tesla also was claimed to be associated with extraterrestrials. There are two people that knew Tesla or wrote about him. One was Arthur Matthews. He wrote a book called Wall of Light. And in that, he says that he was contacted by extraterrestrials who told him that Tesla was from Venus and that Tesla himself believed that he was from Venus. So both in the case of Tesla and Maria Orsic, people that are fundamental in the development of time travel, both of them are linked to extraterrestrial civilizations. And according to two of my sources, that is Jean-Charles Moyen and David Rousseau, who I've interviewed, you've probably listened to those interviews on my Exopolitics Today YouTube channel or podcast, you've heard them say that they encountered Maria Orsic on a Galactic Federation of Worlds flagship, or actually more correctly, that they encountered her on a joint US-French spacecraft that was part of the Solar Warden program that was called the Solaris, that Maria Orsic was a teacher on that. So Orsic has these galactic connections. So it's not surprising when we consider that back in 1919 and in the early 1920s, she had played such a powerful role in helping Germans develop these breakthrough technologies using something called the Vril energy, because this was a force and energy that pervaded the universe that she encouraged people to develop an understanding of this, because once this was channeled in the right way, you could use very advanced technologies. And so this was something that the Germans believed in very strongly. Actually, it wasn't just the Germans. It was occultists around the world. There was a British occultist by the name of Edward Bulwer-Lytton who wrote a book, I think it was 1877, called Vril, the Coming Race. And this was something that was created a storm in the occult world at the time, that there was this force called the Vril. And if you learned to master it, not only could your psychic abilities become enhanced and you could do incredible things, but you could use this for activating incredibly powerful technologies. So this was something that occultists believed in generally, but Maria Orsic and the German Vril Society, they took this to another level. So she was in contact with the Aldebaran ETs, and that is from the constellation Aldebaran. And they gave her instructions, technical information, on building an interstellar space-time device. Now, this is important to keep in mind, that it was never considered to be a spacecraft. Okay, it was a time travel device that also functioned as a spacecraft. So this was a space-time device. There was no way that this Vril craft could travel from the Earth to the Aldebaran star system, which is, I think it's, at the top of my head, I think it's 70 light years away, something like that. There was no way it could travel there. Using any kind of conventional propulsion system. You would use exotic propulsion system, and that propulsion system would utilize space-time so that it could travel there and spend whatever time necessary there, and then come back with a very short period of time having elapsed. So it was designed to be an interstellar space-time device. Now, exactly how it worked, it used a combination of torsion fields and electrogravitics, or high-powered electrostatic charges, that somehow this combined with rotating magnetic fields, that all of this combined to produce this kind of breakthrough space-time device. Similar to how with Tesla, I mentioned earlier, Tesla coil could use electrostatic charges to warp space-time and using rotating electromagnetic fields. Similar principle with this Vril spacecraft. Now, the first Vril prototypes were built by Professor Winifred Schumann, and he was a full professor at the Technical University of Munich, and he was the director of the electrophysical laboratory from 1924 to 1961, and he was very close to Maria Orsic. He was also a member of the German secret societies, and his specialty was high voltage electrostatics and rotating high energy plasma. So his skill set or knowledge of what happens when you generate very large electrostatic charges and when you are spinning plasma or when you have rotating magnetic fields, that was his specialty. So that was in the 1920s that he was specializing in this. And he built Vril prototypes. Now, people often say, well, what evidence is there for those fantastic claims? Well, there actually is evidence. And so there's a document there. And what that document shows is that that's W.O. Schumann. He's on the list of German scientists taken to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base as part of Operation Paperclip. And Wright-Patterson Air Force Base was where they took the recovered Vril and Hannibal spacecraft that were taken out of Nazi Germany at the end of the Second World War under Operation Lusty. So the Americans brought the Army Air Force brought all of those flying saucer technologies to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. At the time, it was actually called Wright Field. In 1947, changed the name to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So this is where they were studied. So this is objective documentary evidence that Schumann was actually involved in flying saucer technologies, and his specialty in high voltage electrostatics and torsion fields or highly pressurized rotating plasma was somehow relevant to the operation of spacecraft. And so this is documentary evidence supporting the claim that Schumann had this kind of skill set where he could build the first Vril prototypes for the Vril Society, or for the Vril Society with Maria Orsic. So torsion fields impact space-time. A torsion field is when you generate a rotating magnetic field, either using kind of rotating magnets or something like a plasma, like a mercury-based plasma that's just rotating at a very high speed. That's generating a magnetic field. And if you rotate these things in opposite directions, it generates a very powerful torsion field. So here's an example of a torsion field generator. So this is the sort of thing that generates this space-time effect that enables craft to travel interstellar distances, so that we're not just talking about a spacecraft like the Voyager or the Pioneer spacecraft that are now outside of our solar system after having traveled for 30, 40 years. We're talking about devices that can bend space-time so that they can go and come back from these very long interstellar trips. So in 1933, the Nazis come to power and take over the Vril space-time program. Now, it's very important to just kind of emphasize that from 1919 up until 1933, that Maria Orsic and the Vril Society and the Vril Society, they were operating under the Weimar Republic, which was a democratic, very principled society that protected civil liberties, and the military played a minor role in that society. So, people often ask, people think, if Maria Orsic was working with the Galactic Federation of Worlds, why did they begin working with Germany, Nazi Germany, and give them all these advanced technologies? I mean, how can they be good? Because people forget that from 1919 up until 1933, Germany was a republic that was the most progressive and open society in all of Europe, including the United States, and where the German military, by law, could not play a prominent role. So this was actually the ideal place where you could introduce these advanced technologies. And I think the idea was that the Weimar Republic would be the vehicle for introducing these advanced technologies to the world. And in fact, William Tompkins, he describes that there were, in addition to Orsic, there were he describes 1,443, a very strange number, of people in this period of history in Germany that were working on these kinds of civilian flying saucer projects. Incredible to think of now, but now we kind of understand that this was actually a good time to introduce these technologies. So why didn't we hear about this? Why haven't we heard about this? because what happened was that the Weimar Republic was sabotaged by the deep state. They brought about its end. And that the deep state actually brought Hitler and the Nazi Party to power. And this is actually factually can be proven. In one of my books, Antarctica's Hidden History, I describe how the deep state did it, that they actually encouraged the German Chancellor to hand power over to Hitler because this would be good for the industrialists. So the industrialists were being helped by none other than the Rockefeller family and the Dulles brothers, who were very much part of this deep state initiative to help bring about an end to the Weimar Republic. So why did they want the Weimar Republic to end? Because they didn't want this kind of technology coming out. So this is a very important part of history. So what happens then? 1933, Hitler comes to power. He takes over the Vril space-time program. Everything now becomes classified. It's under the control of the Nazi SS. And soon after that, Hitler reaches agreements with reptilian extraterrestrials. And so this leads to operational craft being given to the Nazis. So the Weimar Republic, Auschwitz, the Vril Society, they're working with members of the Galactic Federation of Worlds to bring about a kind of civilian spacecraft industry and to distribute that to the world. That is shut down. The Nazis come to power, they take everything over, and the Nazis then reach agreements with these guys, the reptilians. And the reptilians then start giving to the Nazis some of these spacecraft, operational craft that they can reverse engineer. And so this was something that William Tompkins discussed in his Revelations, in his 3-volume series of books selected by extraterrestrials. He discussed how the US Navy had an intelligence program where they learned about the Nazis being given these spacecraft, multiple spacecraft by the reptilians. And William Tompkins said that the Nazis received 34 different types of spacecraft by the reptilians, and that they had 34 prototypes or models that they were developing based on what they'd received from the reptilians. So that's just an abbreviated history of all this. There's a lot there. You can go to my book, Antarctica's Hidden History, where I talk all about this in depth. I did a webinar that was, I believe, a 4-hour webinar on Antarctica, the Dark Fleet, and you can find out more just by going to my Vimeo webpage and go to exapolitics.org and there look under webinars if you want to watch that particular webinar to hear about how the Nazis were able to get this help and move forward in developing a dark fleet in Antarctica. Now, bringing it back to the idea of time travel, how is all this relevant to time travel? Well, remember that limerick that I mentioned? There was this young lady called Bright whose speed was faster than light. She set off one day in a relative way and came back the previous night. If you are developing spacecraft for a dark fleet intent on imperial conquest, if you had the capability of departing after your arrival from the project, that would be very, very helpful operationally. So this is something that a number of insiders have talked about, that the Dark Fleet began to use time travel as a standard operating procedure because their spacecraft, as I said, they're not just spacecraft. They're space-time devices. They can bend space-time, and it's not, and they can actually move forward and back in time depending on their mission. So once the Dark Fleet begins a mission, they first make sure that they return from the mission before their departure. So the missions are completed by the return prior to the departure. So the captains don't go ahead with the mission if they don't first witness their return. So Tony Rodriguez, he talks about this in his book, Ceres Colony Cavalier, where he spent, I think it was 13 years with the Dark Fleet, working on one of their merchant ships. And he says this was standard operating procedure, that when going off on a mission, first you would make sure, the captain would make sure that, once he received the mission instructions, what to do for that mission, he would, before departing, he would make sure that they arrived first, which meant that time travel was used to first arrive before your departure. And once the captain saw that he had arrived back from the mission, then he knew to depart, that it was okay, the mission had been completed successfully. That way they would know that if he didn't come back, that this was not a mission to depart on. So this was how time travel was used by the Dark Fleet to conduct missions. Tony Rodriguez talked about it. Corey Good also talked about it. In one of my articles on exopolitics.org, Secret Interstellar Spacecraft Use Superluminal Tachyon Drives, it's very interesting that the secret space program craft that Corey Good says he served on was named after Arthur Sommerfeld, because he was the guy that came up with Einstein with the anti-telephone effect. In other words, he was the guy responsible for the theoretical development of tachyons, enabling faster than that tachyons are these faster than light particles that enable one to travel backwards in time. So the very fact that so I think it's called the Arnold Sommerfeld. That's right, Arnold Sommerfeld, not Arthur. Arnold Sommerfeld. So Arnold Sommerfeld. So this was one of these craft that could use this kind of space-time effect, and that tachyon drives have been around for a long time, at least from the time the Dark Fleet began using them in the 1940s, and then later they became used in the Solar Warden space program. Now, according to the sources, the Solar Warden program became operational in the late 1970s and early 1980s. So this is when the tachyon drives began to be used by the US Navy as part of their space program. So we get an idea now of time travel as it was developed by the Germans for their space programs, or for their Dark Fleet space program based out of Antarctica, and how that was operationalized. Now, in terms of the role of the US Navy and the development of time travel, it doesn't just begin in 1978. It actually begins quite a bit earlier than that. And what I'm going to do is play you a short clip that runs for about 3 minutes. It involves Al Bielek, who is one of the Montauk Project witnesses, and he discusses how time travel research began in the United States with the US Navy. So I'm going to play that clip and then we'll come back.
On the subject of time travel, I think a few comments are necessary, or at least desirable on my part. Many people cannot accept the idea of time travel. Many scientists, for that matter, cannot. They say it's impossible. But again, we get to that strange schism between, pardon the expression, public science and private science. By public science, I mean that which is taught in the universities and is commonly accepted throughout industry and the trade. The private science being that which is restricted to only a few, to certain government agencies, to certain major private corporations that help build some of this hardware in secret. And there is a large gap, a large schism there. of to be, I think, an average of 50 years. In reality, science and technology is about 50 years ahead of what is reported and taught in the usual school systems and even the best school systems. With the idea that, as I have found, time travel is a reality, it actually was first accidentally discovered in 1936. It goes back to a Navy expedition involving a brand new USS Kearsarge, digging around in the South Atlantic, north of the shores of South America, perhaps on the fringe of the so-called Bermuda Triangle. They found a large crystalline structure on the floor of the ocean, sent divers down to examine it. The next thing they knew, the Kearsarge disappeared. About 2 months later, it came back with a very strange explanation. That it had time traveled into the future, and those people in the future realized what had happened, knew about the Atlantean installations, and showed them how to calibrate their system, because these crystals were activated by a combination of electronic, or actually RF and magnetic energies of a certain combination, certain frequencies, and so forth, that were key to turn this thing on. And they knew that the Atlanteans had built these ages ago, when Atlantis was an empire that was traveling all over the world, moving heavy hardware everywhere. So they used them for transport of large and very heavy cargoes from point A to point B almost instantaneously. Didn't have to expend any fuel on it. It was a very quick and easy and very inexpensive transportation for very heavy loads. It was also usable, as the Kearsarge found out, for time travel. They were told how they could calibrate the system, and by the end of 2 years of research, they figured out a system to utilize this system of crystals, which apparently are in the ocean floor all over the U.S. All over the world. So they found out that they could use this system for time travel.
So there you have Al Bielek talking about this incident from 1936 involving this U.S. drilling ship called the Kearsarge, that it stumbled upon this Atlantean crystal buried somewhere in the vicinity of the Bermuda Triangle, and that once it activated, the Kearsarge was taken into the future, and then when they came back, they had information from future humans on how to calibrate crystals, or Atlantean crystals, for time travel technology. So this was 1936, and this is kind of like, of course, independent from what was happening in Nazi Germany at the time, that the Kearsarge and the US Navy began experimenting with manipulating crystals using RF frequencies and electronics to be able to produce some kind of time travel effect. So that from 1936, the US Navy was very interested in time travel. So this takes us to the so-called Philadelphia experiment. And Nikola Tesla and Albert Einstein were recruited to Princeton University's Institute for Advanced Studies in 1933, and they were looking at space-time experiments. Now, the Kearsarge incident happened 3 years later, and they clearly recognized that this was something that could be utilized using very large equipment. Because imagine if you could use, or you could bend space-time, and you could transport a whole ship to another point in space-time. Obviously, for warfighting, that would be tremendously important, because you could transport your ships into the past or into the future, or anywhere using space-time, and that would give you a tremendous tactical advantage over your enemies. Now, of course, with the Philadelphia experiment, things went south. I mean, it didn't turn out right. The Philadelphia experiment itself has largely been shown to have happened. That this was something that there's been multiple sources that confirm it happened. Now, the ostensible reason for the Philadelphia experiment was radar invisibility, and the kind of idea that is promoted is that while they were experimenting with radar invisibility using these high voltage electrostatic charges and rotating magnetic fields, and accidentally it was a space-time effect. Well, actually, no, the radar invisibility was always just a cover. It was always a space-time experiment using, we were trying to transport the ship, which they were trying to replicate what happened to the Kearsarge from 1936. They were trying to replicate that in the 1943 experiment, the Philadelphia experiment. So this takes me to something that I just didn't realize the significance of it until I re-listened to what Billac had to say about the Kearsarge and what had happened when it went into the future. So I wrote an article about that where you can listen to it online, the actual clip where Billac talks about it. I'm going to play it for you now in case you haven't read that article or listened to the clip where Billac talks about how time travel was used to win World War II. So let's move forward and I'll play the clip now.
Stories I ran into and the information I had, which partly came out of Los Alamos Laboratories Black Vault, as did so much other things, was they found out how to calibrate it. They were able to use the Kearsarge and later a number of other ships similarly outfitted with the appropriate equipment for time travel into the future. And this allegedly, according to my information, became essential to the winning of World War II against Nazi Germany. We had to pull some hardware out of the future, modify a few things, and even if you look at the end of the war, wherein we dropped a plutonium bomb as well as a standard uranium gun barrel type bomb on Japan. The one in Hiroshima was a uranium gun barrel bomb, and the one in Nagasaki, by public statement, was a plutonium bomb. One has to ask some very serious questions. Since in the record of the development of the atomic bomb, the test at Trinity Flats was stated in the manuals and the declassified information to be a plutonium bomb, and that it took all of the production of plutonium out of Hanford Engineering Works for over a year to produce enough plutonium of bomb grade that they could use to test a bomb. They were so concerned about whether it would work or not because they implied previous failures, which was true. They put a very heavy steel shell around the bomb in case it fails, that they wouldn't lose the plutonium, they could salvage it. Of course, it did happen that that particular device exploded quite well, left a nice glassy plating on the desert floor, and was seen for many, many miles. That took all of the plutonium that we had produced up to that time. How did we, within 1 month, get enough plutonium to build a bomb and drop it on Nagasaki? That has never been answered. And I think the answer lies in the fact that we had time travel capability and took some of the plutonium production out of the future, where in the 80s and 90s and 70s even, we were able to produce it in rather large amounts, relatively speaking. The Russians, over 40 years, in one of their secret cities, have built up a stock of 40 tons of bomb-grade plutonium they don't know what to do with. And they're still producing it. So it's not that difficult to produce once you have the proper facilities. Other than that one specific instance, I'm told there were other instances of time travel being used to produce hardware in the future, that is our era, let us say the 80s, to be used during the period of World War II. The bottom line was we militarily defeated Hitler and the Axis powers and Japan, and the world settled back to an uneasy peace.
So that's very fascinating information from Billac. So the official history is all, as far as those of us that look at kind of like these alternative sources, the Philadelphia experiment was a dismal failure, so there's agreement on that. And supposedly the time travel experiments didn't resume until much later. But what Billac is telling us is that, in fact, they did continue. And that during the Second World War, they were able to do some of these time travel experiments to get future weapons. that they were able to go to the 1970s and the 80s and even the 90s to Cold War Europe or to the United States and show up in the United States, a ship, maybe whatever ship it was that was rigged out to do the time travel experiment or to do the time travel would show up and say, hey, we're from 1944 and we're in the midst of the fight against the Nazis. We need some plutonium. We need a plutonium so that we can build our bomb. Can you give us some? And anything else you have. And apparently this was something that was used to win the Second World War, according to the information that Al Bielek got. So that was new to me. I didn't realize the significance of that because it tells us that the Philadelphia experiment was maybe a cover for other successful time travel experiments using Navy ships to go into the future. And of course, as I mentioned later on, by the 1970s and 80s, you have the Navy ships that were part of the Solar Warden programs that could travel through space-time. But this is the kind of forerunner to that. During the Second World War, they were using this time travel technology that had been given to them by future humans, and that was used to win the Second World War. So what that tells us then is that the Second World War was really a temporal war. Now, previously I've talked about the Second World War being a temporal war involving different groups of extraterrestrials, the reptilians working through the Nazis, and the Andromedans, the Andromeda Council working with the Ashtar Command and the Galactic Federation of Worlds. I talked about that in my recent book, or my latest book, Galactic Federations, Councils and Secret Space Programs. I talk about the temporal wars. What Al Bielek has brought in is another dimension to that temporal war that I hadn't considered, and that is that future humans actually played a big role in this temporal war, that they were giving the United States and the Allies, and presumably the Russians were also getting help as well, to defeat Nazi Germany from future humans. So it wasn't just extraterrestrials intervening in this period in human history, but also future humans. And that kind of makes sense. I mean, if we consider that there's this kind of non-interference principle by extraterrestrials, well, you would think that that applies across different timelines as well. But future humans wouldn't be restrained from that. So it makes sense that the United States in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, that the US government, if they get approached by a ship that's part of, that comes from the Second World War era, and this ship says, hey, we're fighting in the midst of the war, we need this, we need that from you, help us out, that they would get that kind of help. So World War II was a temporal war involving extraterrestrials and future humans. Now, how far into the future do the humans come from in intervening in contemporary affairs? Now, Bielek was talking about the 1940s, and he was saying that future humans from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s came and helped the US to win the Second World War. Now, we do have soft disclosure of this temporal war. Now, this is a way you hide the truth in plain sight. The truth is that there's been a temporal war involving not just extraterrestrials, but also future humans, and that they have been involved in human affairs throughout our history. So this is 2 episodes from the Star Trek Enterprise series. Very good series. I think this is, of all the Star Trek series, this is the one that really explains the temporal war, how that operates. So in this case, you have the Germans or the Nazis being helped by extraterrestrials, and future humans, which is Captain Archer and his team, go back in time and they help deal with the Nazis and these extraterrestrials from the future in terms of restoring the timeline, that the timeline had been disrupted by this extraterrestrial intervention. So, this is hiding the truth in plain sight. You put into fiction something that has truly been happening, that is known in the classified world, but you don't want the public to know about it. So, that's a secret that's pretty hard to keep forever. So you hide it in plain sight by having shows like Star Trek talk about it. Now, time travel and the Star Trek series, in one of my books, Space Force, Our Star Trek Future, I talk about Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, and Leslie Stevens IV. He's the creator of the Outer Limits TV series, and he was the guy that actually had Gene Roddenberry sit on the second series of the Outer Limits series to take in what was happening. Now, the Outer Limits was phenomenally successful. Its first season, it generated a huge audience, and it was really, really popular. And this worried the deep state. So what they did was they made sure that the Outer Limits would not survive. So for its second season, they rescheduled it from a Monday night where it was succeeding phenomenally, doing really well, and they scheduled it for a Saturday night, and it was up against the Jackie Gleason show. And Americans love their comedy, and Jackie Gleason was so popular that this was the death knell for the Outer Limits TV series. They just couldn't compete against Jackie Gleason, and Gleason himself has a very interesting history when it comes to the extraterrestrial phenomenon. So they decided that Outer Limits would not continue for a second year, because the Outer Limits series was revealing a lot of the classified technologies that were being used by the Navy. Because Leslie Stevens IV, he was the son of Vice Admiral Leslie Stevens, who was part of the creation, or he was involved in the creation of the US Navy's secret space program. He was an aeronautical engineer, and he played a key role in setting up the Navy's secret space program, as I've described in some of my earlier books. So Leslie Stevens IV, the son of the Navy Admiral, knows about the secret space program. In fact, he or Gene Roddenberry were taken into the future. So just imagine that. Imagine Gene Roddenberry or Leslie Stevens, imagine them in 1965 being taken into the future, maybe 70 years into the future. So 65, and so they get taken into, say, the 2030s. And they see something that appears to be very similar to Star Trek, where our planet is united under some kind of overall federation-style government. We are part of a galactic federation of worlds, or what do they call it, the United Federation of Planets. And we are a galactic culture. So this is in the 2030s. So this time travel technology existed. As I mentioned, Al Bielek was saying that they were taking people based on the Atlantean crystal that was discovered in 1936 by the Kearsarge, and then during the Second World War, they were taking people into the future to kind of learn about future technologies, and then coming back to help the Navy win the Second World War, or help the US win the Second World War. So by the 1950s, 1960s, the US is doing this. They're taking people into the future and coming back with information for helping develop a future space program, the Solar Warden Space Program. So Gene Roddenberry and Leslie Stevens are taken into the future. They see all this. Either one of them, I think it was probably Leslie Stevens, the fourth, that was taken into the future. He sees what was happening, which made sense because he was the son of a vice admiral. He was also part of Army intelligence during the Second World War. And people commented on Leslie Stevens and said he was a spook embedded within Hollywood to do soft disclosure on behalf of the US military. So people in the Hollywood entertainment industry always suspected Stevens played this role. And he truly is a fascinating person. So I think Stevens was taken into the future, saw what was going on. He comes back, and in 1964, 65, he tells Gene Roddenberry, hey, you got to come up with a new sci-fi series. I'll show you how to do it. So Gene Roddenberry sat in the final season of Outer Limits, saw everything, met all the actors. He met Leonard Nimoy, the future Spock. He met William Shatner, the future Kirk, and met a bunch of others that starred in the Star Trek series. And that's how Star Trek began, because of Leslie Stevens IV. So I think this is an example of time travel being used for soft disclosure and for seeding humanity with the ideas of our future. So it wasn't just that the future was intervening in human affairs to transfer technologies to help win the war, but it was also seeding our present era with knowledge and information that would help us culturally prepare for what is coming. So now I'm going to shift gear and we're going to move to another aspect of time travel. This is Father Pellegrino Ernetti's chronovisor technology. There is a book by Peter Grassa that is discussing this. He was a Dominican, I believe. He was a Dominican priest, and he was analysing harmonic frequencies of Benedictine chants and found that these could open windows to past events. So he's using RF and electromagnetic frequencies, and he's experimenting with the chants of these Benedictine monks and assessing what would happen when you manipulate those frequencies with RF and various electromagnetic frequencies, and found that you could open windows to past events. And so he says that using this kind of technology, that he was able to witness Jesus' crucifixion and other historical events. So in the book, Father Ernetti's Chronovisor, you can get it on Amazon, it discusses what it was that he was able to do. Now here's a quote extracted from the book. Quote, Father Ernetti described a device he called a chronovisor that looked a bit like a television. Instead of receiving broadcasts from local transmission stations, however, the chronovisor could tune into the past to allow the viewer to see and hear events that had occurred years or even centuries earlier. Father Ernetti told Brune that the machine worked by detecting all the sights and sounds that humanity had made that still floated through space. So somehow this machine, the chronovisor, could tune into some kind of Akashic record of past events that were somehow recorded in space-time, and using radio frequencies and kind of vocal frequencies chanting, you could activate that and you could look into these past events. And so this was something that floated through space. But of course, we know radio signals can float through space, but if you interfere with chantings or manipulate those through radio frequencies, somehow some sort of quantum event occurs where distant radio waves or photonic light of past events that's traveling through space, that somehow that can be seen on this device, this kind of chronovisor. So that was the kind of work that Father Ernetti was doing. And so, well, is this something that was really going on? Well, there's another source that describes this. This is George Van Tassel, and he was one of the early contactees. He was one of the people that really was very influential in putting out the testimonies of people that say that they had face-to-face encounters with extraterrestrials. So he talks about time travel, and he talks about how the extraterrestrials were helping him and other inventors understand time travel. So this is what he said in an interview he gave in 1964. Now, with this and other clips I've played, these are some very old clips, so apologies for the quality of the sound and the visuals, but I think you'll appreciate the significance of listening to these historical events, because you have people in the 1960s talking about time travel experiments happening in the day and how the Navy came in and classified that research. So let me play that for you.
Jack, we've discovered this zone is subject to thought. Now, since time doesn't record events the way we do on calendars and clocks, you could only record an event by thinking of it. Now, theoretically, we believe we can take a videotape magnetic camera into the time zone and photograph Lincoln's Gettysburg Address or Caesar's armies marching or anything that's ever happened.
Let me get this straight. In other words, you're telling me, like H.G. Wells imagined 50 years ago, that everything that happened in time is still there to be seen by the recreation electronically of a thought which exists.
Jack, you know how you talk into a tape on a tape recorder and play the interruptions back, identical to the play that you made. The Earth's magnetic field is the same way. You can put interruptions into it and play them back out of it. An associate of ours in creating a magnetic coupler with its principle coupled in the Earth's magnetic field and played back TV shows from stations that aren't even in business anymore.
You mean an experiment has been done to bring out of the air television programs which have been and gone?
Been and gone.
Now, where was this experiment conducted?
It was conducted in Santa Monica by an associate of mine.
Why hasn't this hit the headlines throughout the world as that's a time machine in action? In fact,
no, Jack, the reason it hasn't hit the world is because, as I understand it now, the Navy Department took him and the research over because he also discovered he could bounce magnetic echoes off the ionosphere and locate submarines under the ocean, regardless of where they were.
Okay, so there you have George Van Tassel confirming that there was these time travel experiments that were being conducted in the early 1960s and that they did involve some kind of device using electromagnetic fields that could tap into some record, some kind of time recording that is traveling or is trapped in the atmosphere in some way, and that this was something that the Navy was very interested in and actually classified the research. And as I said, if we accept what Bilek had said, the Navy didn't want this information getting out because they were already doing it. They were already conducting time travel experiments and getting information from the future for not only winning the Second World War, but also for developing a future space program. So George Van Tassel and these time travel experiments. So this is something that 2 decades later, you have that similar idea of some kind of screen or device that you could look into to see the past, that is Project Looking Glass, that the US Navy was running, that was part of the long-term time travel experiments that were run by the Navy. So we have the first mention of Project Looking Glass made by Bob Lazar, and he came out in 1989, and he was given access to a thick dossier of briefing documents for his assignment to S4. I mean, he was there to look at the propulsion system of these flying saucer craft. He saw 9 of these craft in the S4 facility at Area 51, and his job was to understand the propulsion system. But in order to do his job, he needed to kind of have a bit of a background on what was going on. So he looked at this thick dossier, which was a briefing document, and in it, one of the documents talk about a time travel project called Looking Glass, also known as the chronovisor. So that is the Lazar, photo of Lazar, a mock-up of the ID that he had while working at the S4 facility at Area 51. So this is what he said in an interview. Wasn't there something about Looking Glass project, Looking Glass? Lazar, yeah, that was later on, when we started getting into the heavy physics of it, because gravity distorts space and time. Einstein's general theory of relativity we discussed earlier, and what they were trying to do. And I say, look back in time, and some people conjure up images of a time tunnel. They're looking at distorting time in microseconds to see whether event they were trying to observe through a gravitational lens. So that was a different project. They were dealing with that. But that was essentially playing with gravity distorting time. So as far as Lazar knew, that these were experiments that could kind of like manipulate time for microseconds. He didn't have a need to know that the Navy had actually succeeded in manipulating space-time, where they could transport ships back and forward in time to get all kinds of things. He didn't need to know that. But the briefing document confirmed that there was a project Looking Glass, and that's the important thing here. Bob Lazar's Navy W2, this confirms that he actually was employed by something called the Department of Naval Intelligence. Now, people often think, well, this is a mistake, and this discredits Lazar, that there's actually an Office of Naval Intelligence, but not a Department of Naval Intelligence. That the Department of Naval Intelligence existed during the Second World War, but then it was disbanded. But in fact, the truth is that the Department of Naval Intelligence went black. Not that it ceased to operate, it became so highly classified that as far as others working in the Navy were concerned, and politicians, of course, the Department of Naval Intelligence no longer existed. But it continued to exist, and it was the one that was involved in this kind of space-time research and developing time machines, and of course a future secret space program. Now, the Vatican, I mentioned Father Anetti's chronovisor. He developed it in the 1950s. The Vatican shared that technology with the CIA in the early 1960s. And the CIA counterintelligence and the Vatican Information Service developed chronovisors for assessing both past events and future events. So why would the Vatican Information Service, which was a spy service set up by the Vatican, why would that work with the CIA? Or why would the CIA be interested in working with the Vatican? Well, the Vatican has the world's most extensive espionage program, and it goes back centuries, much, much older than the CIA, and even older than British military intelligence, which dates back to the time of Queen Elizabeth and John Dee. That the Vatican's intelligence network goes back further in time than that. So the Vatican's intelligence service is the oldest on the planet, and the CIA counterintelligence chief in the 1960s, actually beginning in the 1950s, his name was James Jesus Angleton. Angleton's he was responsible for the CIA counterintelligence division. But he also handled the Vatican desk, and he also handled the Mossad, or the Israeli desk. Why? Why those? Because the Vatican and the Mossad have worked very closely with the CIA for decades in unraveling and monitoring all these developments as far as space-time breakthroughs and exotic technologies are concerned. So there you have a representation of the way the chronovisor worked according to what Father Anetti developed, and that was handed off to the CIA in the 1960s.
This concludes part 1 of our deep dive into the science, technology, evidence, and existence of time travel and temporal warfare. Tick the notification bell to be notified of future episodes. You have been listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Join or start a conversation in the comments. Take the time to explore the vast library of best-selling books, webinars, and podcasts by Dr. Salla. Visit exopoliticstoday.com.